My golden father gave me 3 days to leave for wanting to be a doctor, not a psychologist like he wanted. 10 years later, hearing my sister was terminally ill, I returned home, but she lied to me. I guess I should start with who I am, or maybe more accurately, who I was raised to think I am. My name's Jacob. Born and bred in one of those old money families, I grew up surrounded by silver spoons, perfectly pressed napkins, and the unshakable belief that we were simply better than most people. It sounds awful, I know. And, yeah, maybe it was. But for my family, that was just life. My parents viewed the world through a strict lens of class and hierarchy. From the moment I was old enough to understand words, I was taught, no, drilled, to believe that we sat firmly at the top of the food chain. My father, Richard, and yes, he insisted I call him that because Dad was too pedestrian, was the definition of authority. He was a man who didn't show an ounce of vulnerability. He'd built the family fortune himself, and he didn't do it with kindness or generosity. No, he ran his business like a dictator, and our family was no exception. Mistakes? Unacceptable. Weakness? Out of the question. And heaven forbid you acknowledged anything, or anyone, beneath us. My mother, Cynthia, matched him in every way that mattered. She was elegant and poised, but wielded her sharp tongue like a weapon. If someone dared to cross her or step out of line, she could cut them down in seconds flat. For them, wealth wasn't just a status, it was our identity. And they never missed a chance to remind me and my sisters exactly who we were, a cut above everyone else. My older sister, Madison, soaked up those lessons better than anyone. She was practically a carbon copy of Richard in all the worst ways, cold, unfeeling, and obnoxiously proud of our last name. Then there was Lila, the youngest. She had a softer edge, sure, but she still carried her privilege like an accessory, flaunting it wherever she went. Our family estate was massive, secluded, and designed to keep the world out. My father made sure of that. Tall iron gates, thick hedges, and a staff that knew their place. It all created this bubble where we could live untouched by the so-called real world. When it came to school, it wasn't much different. I went to a private academy where the tuition alone could have bought someone a decent house. There, I wasn't just Jacob. I was Jacob Lexington, part of the Lexington family. Everyone knew our name. That reputation followed me everywhere, and with it came two types of people: those who clung to me, hoping for a little status by association, and those who avoided me entirely. Either way, I didn't care. If anything, it made life easier. I leaned into it, playing the arrogant role I knew so well, just like my father. Truthfully, it made me sick sometimes. Not that I'd ever admit it, even to myself. Because at the end of the day, I was Jacob Lexington. And that meant something. At least, that's what I was told. Wealthy. Untouchable. Destined to take the reins and run the empire just like my father. That was my future, carved in stone before I could even spell my last name. But here's the twist. Despite everything I'd been taught, part of me always felt disconnected from it all. I had doubts. Questions. There were nights I'd sit through those excruciating family dinners, listening to my father lecture about why we were different, why we were better, and feel this strange, hollow ache in my chest. It was like something inside me knew it didn't belong. But in my family, questioning the doctrine was unthinkable. So, I did what any obedient son would do. I buried those doubts, shoved them deep where no one could see, and played the part they expected of me. As I got older, the pressure grew unbearable. My father made it clear that one day, I'd inherit the family business, the empire he'd built brick by brick. But the idea of following in his footsteps felt suffocating. Being a Lexington wasn't just a name, it was a label burned into my very existence. Everywhere I went, every decision I made, it wasn't just Jacob making a choice. It was Jacob Lexington. And nothing less than perfection would do. Stepping out of line wasn't just frowned upon, it was forbidden. When I got to college, I started testing the boundaries, even if only in small ways. I signed up for classes that actually interested me, philosophy, history, even psychology, things that made me think instead of just preparing me to be another ruthless businessman. I started hanging out with people who didn't care about wealth or status, people who didn't flinch at the sound of my last name. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. But guilt followed me everywhere, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I'd hear my father's voice in my head, that cold, commanding tone warning me to stay away from the wrong crowd. He'd drilled it into me that people outside our world would never understand us, that they'd only hold me back or try to use me. Still, I couldn't stop myself from craving something different. It all came to a head one summer when I was back home. My father had thrown one of his infamous family gatherings, a grand event with the whole extended clan in attendance. Uncles, aunts, cousins, everyone dressed to the nines, all cut from the same elitist cloth. At some point, my father pulled me aside, his hand gripping my shoulder with a force that made me wince. "Jacob," he said, his voice low but firm, his eyes like steel, "you need to remember who you are and where you come from. This family doesn't bend, and we sure as hell don't bow. One day, all of this will be yours. You need to be ready for that responsibility." The weight of his words hit me like a ton of bricks. I was supposed to become the next Richard Lexington, carrying on the family name with the same cold, merciless ambition. But for the first time in my life, I felt something crack inside me. I wasn't sure I wanted it. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, I slipped out of the house and just drove. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I had to get away, even if only for a little while. Eventually, I ended up at this tiny, run-down diner on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place my family wouldn't be caught dead in, the kind of place that was everything we weren't. I ordered a coffee and sat in a corner booth, staring out at the flickering neon sign outside. For the first time in my life, I felt normal. No one there looked at me like I was someone important. No one whispered my name like it carried weight. I was just another guy drinking coffee in a quiet diner. And for those few hours, that was enough. Just another guy in a diner. That's all I was in that moment, and it was exhilarating. I didn't realize how long I'd been there until the sky outside started to lighten, soft streaks of dawn breaking through the darkness. I dragged myself back home, bracing for the inevitable explosion if my father found out where I'd been. But when I slipped through the front door, the house was silent. No one had noticed I was gone. Relief washed over me, but there was something else too, a strange, hollow disappointment. It was like I wanted someone to notice, to confront me, to force the conversation I didn't have the guts to start myself. That night awakened something in me. It was like I'd found a crack in the suffocating walls my family had built around me, and now I couldn't stop looking for ways to slip through. I started sneaking out more often, finding little out-of-the-way places where no one cared about my last name, where I could just be. A greasy diner, a dive bar, even a public park at night, it didn't matter. In those stolen hours, I felt alive. Free. For once, I wasn't Jacob Lexington, heir to the empire. I was just Jacob. But deep down, I knew it couldn't last. My father, Richard, wasn't the kind of man to miss something like that for long. And when he found out, there would be hell to pay. Sure enough, one night I came home and found him waiting in his study. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the desk lamp. The shadows played across his face, making his already sharp features look even harsher. He didn't yell, didn't fly into one of his infamous tirades. That wasn't his style. No, he just stared at me with this cold, cutting disappointment that hit harder than any shout ever could. "You think you can just walk away from this family," he said, his voice low and steady, the kind of tone that made your stomach drop. "After everything we've given you?" I wanted to say it, I really did. I wanted to tell him I never asked for any of it. That maybe I didn't want the life he'd carved out for me. But I knew it would be pointless. In Richard's world, there was only one path, one way to live. Anything else was weakness. And weakness was unacceptable. From that night on, he kept me on a tight leash. Tighter than ever. He was always watching, always making sure I stayed in line. The tiny taste of freedom I'd found was snatched away, replaced by the crushing weight of expectation. Once again, I was Jacob Lexington, future king of the empire. Whether I wanted the crown or not didn't matter. The truth is, I'd always felt like an outsider in my own family. They lived and breathed the business, thrived on the thrill of profits, the cutthroat negotiations, the power plays that left no room for emotion. My father, Richard, was the embodiment of that mindset. He didn't just run the business. He was the business. In his eyes, success was measured in money, control, and the continuation of the Lexington legacy. And he expected me to carry that torch without question. It started early, practically before I could walk. My father made sure I was surrounded by the tools of his trade, finance, strategy, industry. He dragged me to meetings, introduced me to his colleagues, and proudly displayed me at company events like a trophy, his chosen successor. "Someday, all of this will be yours," he'd say, like it was supposed to inspire me. But all it did was fill me with dread. As I got older, the grooming intensified. Tutors were brought in to teach me the fine art of negotiation, the mechanics of supply and demand, and the cold calculation it took to run a business empire. Emotions, sentiment, those were liabilities, weaknesses to be stamped out. Looking back, it was obvious. Richard Lexington wasn't raising a son. He was building an heir. A perfect, polished replacement for himself, someone who could pick up where he left off and carry the family name forward with the same ruthless ambition. But the more he tried to shape me into his image, the more I felt myself pulling away. The tug was subtle at first, barely noticeable. But as the years went on, it became impossible to ignore. I didn't want his world. I didn't want the life he'd mapped out for me before I even had a say. Still, the weight of his expectations was inescapable, and with every passing year, it grew heavier. But business, that wasn't me. My mind was drawn to people, not profits. I was endlessly fascinated by what made people tick, their motivations, their fears, the things that kept them awake at night. I wanted to understand the mind, to dive into the intricacies of human behavior. To my father, people were nothing more than assets or liabilities. He didn't care why they acted the way they did, only how he could use them. But to me, people were puzzles, complex, messy, and deeply interesting. When I finally mustered the courage to tell him I wanted to study psychology, his reaction was unlike anything I'd seen before. Tom Lexington was a man who rarely showed his emotions, but in that moment, they were written all over his face. Shock, disbelief, and a flicker of rage. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just stood there, staring at me with eyes as hard as stone. Finally, he spoke, spitting the word out like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "Psychology." "Yeah, Dad," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I'm not interested in business. I want to do something different." He laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that made my stomach twist. "Different," he repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "Do you have any idea what you're giving up? The opportunities you're throwing away? Psychology won't pay the bills, Jacob. It won't secure your future. And it damn sure won't uphold the Lexington name." I wanted to tell him the Lexington name didn't mean a damn thing to me. That I'd rather be true to myself than spend my life as a cog in the family machine. But deep down, I knew it was pointless. He wouldn't understand. To him, there was no life outside the one he'd built for me. So, I stayed silent, choking on a mix of anger and sadness I couldn't quite put into words. From that day on, things changed between us. Tom didn't yell or rage. He didn't have to. His disappointment was loud enough. He stopped including me in business discussions, stopped referring to me as his successor. Instead, he made his disdain clear in other ways: snide remarks at family dinners, icy glares when I walked into a room, effusive praise for my sisters and their unwavering loyalty to the family values. I'd become an outsider in my own home. College became my lifeline. I threw myself into my studies, immersing myself in classes that challenged me and opened my mind in ways I'd never imagined. I met people who saw the world differently, people who valued compassion, curiosity, and connection over money and status. They didn't care about my last name, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to hide who I was. My friends were artists, writers, and philosophers, the kind of people my father would have dismissed without a second thought. But to me, they felt more like family than my own blood ever had. One of those friends was Natalie. She was a fellow psychology major, razor-sharp and full of this vibrant, chaotic energy that pulled everyone in. She had a wicked sense of humor that could slice through my brooding like a knife, and she never hesitated to call me out when I got too wrapped up in my own head. "Jacob," she'd say, her tone equal parts teasing and serious, "have you ever actually tried to talk to your dad? I mean, really talk to him?" I'd always laugh it off, deflecting with some dry comment about how that would go over like a lead balloon. But deep down, her words struck a chord. Natalie had a way of seeing right through me, past the layers of sarcasm and carefully constructed walls. She challenged me in ways no one else ever had, pushing me to question the things I'd always taken for granted: my family, my beliefs, even myself. Have you even tried talking to your father? About what you want? Or are you just letting him make all the decisions for you? Natalie's words hit like a hammer, but she didn't understand. She couldn't. She didn't know what it felt like to carry the weight of my father's expectations or the power he held over me. But she didn't push. She just listened, without judgment, and for that, I was grateful. Natalie became my anchor. When I felt myself drifting further and further away from my family, she was the one who kept me grounded. One night, after a few too many beers at a college party, I spilled everything. The family legacy, the pressure, the suffocating weight of my father's disappointment, it all came tumbling out in a rambling, messy confession. Part of me braced for her reaction, expecting pity or maybe even that detached curiosity I'd seen from others when they learned about my old money upbringing. But instead, she just laughed. "Jacob, you don't have to be your father," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You're allowed to carve out your own path. You don't owe him your life." It was like hearing something in a foreign language, unfamiliar, yet strangely liberating. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future that didn't revolve around the Lexington legacy. A future where I could just be Jacob, a guy who studied psychology and tried to make sense of the world. But freedom, I quickly learned, wasn't that simple. When I graduated, I was offered an internship at a clinic specializing in trauma and mental health. It was exactly the kind of work I'd always dreamed of doing. For the first time, I felt like I was on the verge of building something that was mine. And then the phone call came. It was my mother. "Your father wants to see you," she said, her voice measured and polite. "He has a proposition." I didn't want to go. I knew whatever he had planned wasn't going to align with what I wanted. But part of me still craved his approval, or at least the chance to make him understand. So I went home, bracing myself for whatever scheme he'd cooked up this time. As always, he was waiting in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand. He looked me over the way you'd appraise a valuable antique, his gaze heavy with judgment. Finally, he spoke. "I've reconsidered," he said, swirling his drink. "You can work in the family business and pursue your little psychology hobby on the side." I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Dad, it's not a hobby. It's my career." Tom waved a hand dismissively, like he hadn't even heard me. "Call it whatever you want, Jacob. But let's not pretend it's going to amount to anything. This family needs an heir. Someone to carry on what I've built. I've invested too much in you to let you just walk away." His words felt like chains tightening around me. I wanted to tell him to shove it, to walk out of that room and never look back. But the fear of disappointing him, of being completely cast out, held me back. So, I agreed. I told myself I could balance both worlds, work for him during the day and keep pursuing my passion on the side. But it was a lie. Working for my father was suffocating. Every decision I made was scrutinized, every mistake amplified into some kind of personal failure. He didn't respect my goals, and he made sure I knew it. At every turn, he reminded me of how I was falling short of the legacy he'd built. It didn't take long for the pressure to crush me. I stopped sleeping, haunted by a constant sense of dread that gnawed at me day and night. My work at the clinic, the one place I thought I could escape, began to suffer. I wasn't focused. I wasn't present. Worse, my friendships started to fray. Even Natalie, who had always been my rock, began to feel the strain of my unraveling. I was losing myself. And then my relationship with Natalie collapsed under the weight of it all. She told me I was losing myself, becoming a shadow of the man she'd once admired. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, to promise her I could still find a way to balance both worlds. But deep down, I knew she was right. The man she cared for was slipping away, swallowed by a life I didn't even want. The breaking point came at yet another family gathering. My father, in his usual grandiose style, was introducing me to a group of business associates. "This," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder, "is my son. The future of the Lexington Empire." He didn't ask if I was okay with it. He didn't care that I wanted nothing to do with that world. To him, I wasn't a person with dreams or desires. I was an extension of himself, a pawn in the game he'd been playing for decades. I could feel my frustration boiling over. I excused myself, heading out to the garden to escape the noise and the suffocating weight of everyone's expectations. I sat there, under the night sky, feeling like the walls of my life were closing in. No matter how hard I tried to make him happy, to be the son he wanted, it was never enough. That night, something inside me snapped. I couldn't keep doing this, not for him, not for anyone. I walked back into the party, weaving through the perfectly dressed guests and the glittering decorations that felt more like shackles than splendor. My heart was pounding, but my resolve was firm. I found my father standing with a group of his peers, holding court like the king he believed himself to be. I didn't hesitate. I looked him in the eye and said, "I'm done. I'm not working for you anymore. I'm going to follow my own path, and you can't stop me." For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, with a dismissive wave, he turned away, as though I were nothing more than a stranger who'd said something inconvenient. I walked out of that room feeling a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The weight of his expectations was gone, but so was any hope of his approval. I was free, but at a cost. The next day, he called me into his study. The air was heavy with silence, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. He leaned back in his leather chair, his expression cold, his anger barely restrained. "If you want to walk out, Jacob, you do it with nothing," he said. His voice was low, measured, and sharp enough to cut. "Not a cent. Not a single resource. You think you're better than this family? Fine. Go prove it." For a moment, I thought he was bluffing. Surely, after years of grooming me, of investing in me, he wouldn't actually cut me off. But the look in his eyes told me otherwise. He was serious. I had a choice: follow the path he'd laid out for me, or leave with absolutely nothing. I didn't waver. 4 years, I'd lived under his thumb, sacrificing my dreams and suffocating under his control. I wasn't about to give in now. With a single nod, I turned my back on him and walked out of that study, fully aware that I was burning every bridge as I did. He didn't call after me. He didn't try to stop me. I packed my things, which wasn't much, and left the house. No one from my family came to see me off. Madison and Lila, my sisters, stood in the doorway, watching with expressions that were equal parts pity and disdain. To them, I wasn't just leaving. I was betraying everything the Lexington name stood for. I met their eyes briefly, searching for some hint of understanding, of solidarity. But there was none. They were loyal to the legacy, just like my father had taught them to be. So, I walked away. Away from the family, the wealth, the expectations, and the suffocating life I'd been born into. For the first time, I was free. And for the first time, I was completely alone. Walking away from my family meant rejecting everything we'd been raised to believe. The Lexington name, the legacy, the expectations, they were all things I had to leave behind. My sisters didn't understand, and I didn't expect them to. To them, I was committing the ultimate betrayal. I left that house with no money, no plan, and no clue what I was going to do next. My pride wouldn't let me reach out to anyone who knew my family. I didn't want a handout. I didn't want sympathy. More than anything, I needed to prove, to myself more than anyone else, that I could make it on my own. The first few nights were rough. I stayed in a cheap motel, watching my limited cash disappear with each passing day. Panic was creeping in, threatening to swallow me whole, but I shoved it aside. I couldn't afford to fall apart. I threw myself into action, applying for every scholarship I could find, leveraging whatever credentials I still had access to. I was relentless, spending hours filling out applications and following up on leads. I reached out to professors, advisors, even old classmates. Eventually, something came through. A small university offered me a scholarship. It wasn't much, but it was enough to scrape by. This time, college was a completely different experience. No luxury apartments. No expensive dinners. No weekend getaways. I lived in a cramped studio apartment, the kind of place where the pipes clanged and the heater barely worked. I took odd jobs to cover what the scholarship didn't, and I kept to myself. My past, the Lexington name, the wealth, the status, was something I left behind. Here, I was just Jacob, a broke psychology student scraping by on determination and caffeine. For the first time, I learned to appreciate things I'd once taken for granted: the warmth of a coffee shop on a freezing winter day, the pride of paying for a meal with money I'd earned, the quiet satisfaction of knowing I was standing on my own 2 feet. It was during this time that I met Alex, one of my professors. Alex was intense, brilliant, and completely uninterested in wealth or status. He saw potential in me, even when I struggled to see it myself. He challenged me, pushed me to my limits, and most importantly, he believed in me. Through Alex, I rediscovered my passion, not just for psychology, but for truly understanding people. What drove them? What shaped their choices? What fears, hopes, and beliefs guided their lives? But then something unexpected happened. I found myself drawn to the world of advertising. It wasn't a deliberate decision, more like a slow realization. Psychology and advertising, I discovered, were deeply intertwined. Both were about understanding people, dissecting their behavior, figuring out what made them tick. Both sought to influence choices, to shape perceptions. The idea of creating messages that could connect with people, move them to action, or even change the way they saw the world lit a fire in me. It wasn't traditional psychology, not in the clinical sense. It was a blend of art and science, and it captivated me. When I graduated, I threw myself headfirst into the advertising world. I started small, working for local agencies and taking on whatever jobs I could find. Market research, brand strategy, consumer psychology, I absorbed everything I could, learning the ropes one grueling day at a time. My days were long, often stretching into nights and weekends. 12-hour shifts weren't unusual, and sleep was a luxury I rarely indulged in. It wasn't glamorous by any stretch of the imagination, but I didn't care. This was my chance to build something for myself, to take the understanding of people that had always fascinated me and turn it into something tangible, something real. I was building something for myself, piece by piece, carving out a life that was mine and mine alone. Years went by, and I climbed the ladder the hard way. I moved from one agency to another, learning everything I could, making connections, and earning a reputation for being relentless. I pushed boundaries and created campaigns that resonated with people, not just flashy ads, but messages that stuck. Yet, even as my career grew, there was a void I couldn't ignore. No matter how many successes I racked up, it felt like something was missing, a nagging emptiness that no amount of professional achievement could fill. But instead of facing it, I buried myself in work. The next project, the next campaign, the next chance to prove myself became my entire focus. By the time I turned 30, I had enough experience, and just enough savings, to take a leap I'd only dreamed of, starting my own agency. I rented a tiny office in a less than glamorous part of town and hired a small, scrappy team. It was terrifying, knowing that everything depended on me. But it was also exhilarating. For the first time, I wasn't just Jacob, the son of a wealthy family. I was Jacob, founder and CEO of Apex Marketing. The agency started small, barely scraping by at first. We took on local clients, mom-and-pop shops, small startups, just to keep the lights on. But the work was good. Honest. My team poured their hearts into every campaign, and so did I. We weren't competing with the big names, at least not yet, but we had something they didn't: heart, creativity, and an unrelenting drive to make an impact. Slowly, word began to spread. We started landing bigger clients, and Apex began to grow. It was around this time that Natalie came back into my life. We hadn't spoken in years, not since college, but she'd heard through the grapevine that I'd started my own agency and decided to reach out. Meeting her again was like stepping into fresh air after years in a stuffy room. Natalie hadn't changed. She was still the sharp, witty, grounded person I remembered, and we fell back into our old rhythm as though no time had passed. Before long, Natalie joined Apex as our lead strategist. With her on board, we took the agency to a whole new level. Our big break came when we landed a campaign for a major tech company, a project that could make or break us. It was the kind of deal that could put Apex Marketing on the map. We poured everything we had into it. Late nights turned into early mornings. Weekends were spent locked in brainstorming sessions. It was brutal, exhausting work, but it paid off. The campaign was a massive success. Suddenly, Apex wasn't just a scrappy little agency. It was a rising star in the industry. We started getting calls from clients who wouldn't have given us the time of day before, and the work kept rolling in. Despite the success, I never forgot where I came from or how I'd started. Those early days of living paycheck to paycheck, wondering how I'd make it, were still fresh in my memory. I made it a point to hire people like me, talented, driven individuals who had been overlooked by bigger agencies. People who knew what it meant to hustle and fight for every opportunity. I built a culture at Apex that valued creativity and resilience over status, heart over ego. In doing so, I created something I was genuinely proud of. Apex wasn't just a business. It was a community, a place where people could grow, thrive, and be their best selves. And in the process, I found myself building more than an agency. I was building a life. Apex Marketing was uniquely ours, a creation born of hard work, resilience, and vision. It had been 12 years since I walked away from my family, 12 years since I'd last spoken to my father. I didn't know if he even knew about my success, and honestly, I didn't care. My life was mine now, free from his expectations and the shadow of the Lexington name. And yet, on some nights, when the world was quiet and sleep wouldn't come, I wondered, did he ever respect me for walking away? Did he ever understand why I had to leave? Then, out of nowhere, came the call. It was Madison, my oldest sister. Her voice was clipped and formal, like she was talking to a business associate rather than her brother. "Jacob," she said, her tone cold as ever. "Father wants to see you." I froze, the words hitting me like a thunderclap. I hadn't thought about him in years, hadn't let myself dwell on the family I'd left behind. But hearing that he wanted to see me stirred something in me. Curiosity, maybe, or the faintest sliver of hope that he'd finally come to terms with the life I'd chosen. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "Why?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her tone softened, a rare crack in her icy demeanor. "He's not well," she said quietly. "He doesn't have much time left. He wants to talk to you." Her words landed like a punch to the gut. Tom Lexington, the unshakable, indomitable force of nature who had ruled our family with an iron fist, was dying. The man I'd thought was unbreakable was now frail, vulnerable, staring down the end of his life. It was a lot to process. "I'll think about it," I said after a long silence, then hung up. My mind was spinning. Part of me wanted to let the past stay buried, to walk away like I had all those years ago. But another part of me, the part one tried to ignore, felt an undeniable pull. This was my father, the man who, for better or worse, had shaped me into who I was. If he wanted to see me, maybe it was time to face him. Maybe it was time to finally understand. The drive back to my parents' estate felt surreal. 12 years had passed since I'd last seen the place. As I drove through the towering gates and up the winding driveway, a knot of apprehension tightened in my stomach. The house looked the same as it always had, grand, imposing, and untouched by time. But to me, it felt different now. Frozen, like a relic from a life I no longer belonged to. I hadn't come back for nostalgia. Madison's call had been brief and businesslike, just like her. She told me father was gravely ill and that he wanted to see me. That was all. The front door opened as I stepped out of the car, and my mother, Sarah, appeared in the doorway. She looked older than I remembered, her once perfectly coiffed hair streaked with gray, but she was still every bit the elegant woman I'd grown up with. For a moment, her face lit up with something that looked like surprise, or maybe relief. And then, just for an instant, I saw something unexpected in her expression. Vulnerability. "Jacob," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she stepped forward. Hearing her say my name after all these years caught me off guard. I hadn't prepared for this moment. I wasn't sure what to say. "Mom," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. She hesitated, as though unsure whether to embrace me or keep her distance. After a moment, she reached out and placed a hand on my arm, her grip surprisingly firm. "It's good to see you," she said softly. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. It was strange to be back here, in this house, with these people I'd once called family. Strange to see the cracks in their armor. "Your father's waiting," she said, pulling herself together. "He's in his study." Of course he was. Where else would he be? I followed her into the house, the familiar scent of polished wood and expensive cologne hitting me like a wave of nostalgia. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, opulent, pristine, and suffocatingly perfect. The study door was slightly ajar, and I could see the faint glow of a lamp spilling into the hallway. My mother gave me a small nod before stepping aside, leaving me to face him alone. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. There he was. My father sat in his leather chair, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. His once imposing frame was frail, his skin pale, and his eyes sunken. But even in his weakened state, there was still a sharpness to his gaze, a flicker of the man who had dominated every room he walked into. "Jacob," he said, his voice raspier than I remembered, but still carrying the weight of authority. I stepped forward, unsure of what to say. All the words I'd rehearsed on the drive here vanished from my mind. "You wanted to see me," I said finally, my tone even. He nodded slowly, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Sit." I hesitated for a moment before taking the seat. The room felt heavy with unspoken words, the air thick with years of tension and unresolved feelings. "Why now?" I asked, breaking the silence. "After all this time, why do you want to see me?" He leaned back, his eyes studying me with a mixture of pride and something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe. "Because," he said slowly, his voice filled with the weight of the years between us, "there are things I need to say before it's too late." "It's been too long," my mother said softly, her voice carrying an unfamiliar tremor. "Yeah, it has," I replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes as I stepped into the foyer. The house was eerily quiet, devoid of the activity and polished chaos I remembered from my childhood. It felt like a museum, grand, cold, and filled with ghosts. I found myself scanning the space, half expecting my father to appear at the top of the staircase, his familiar scowl etched into his face. But the stairs remained empty, the silence unbroken. Sarah led me into the sitting room, where Madison and Lila were waiting. Both of them stood stiffly, their tension palpable. Madison was the first to speak, her tone as clipped and formal as ever. "Jacob, thank you for coming," she said, barely glancing in my direction. "Father is upstairs resting. We thought it would be best to speak with you first." Something about the way they were all looking at me felt off, too calculated, too rehearsed. I took a deep breath, trying to push down my unease. I'd come here to see my father, to face whatever unfinished business lingered between us. But the way they were acting made me feel like I'd walked into a trap. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. "Does he even know I'm here?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Madison and Lila exchanged a quick, uneasy glance. My mother's face tightened, her composure faltering for just a moment. "Not exactly," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "We thought, if you were here, he might come around. He needs you, Jacob. The family needs you." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I stared at them, anger and disbelief crashing over me. I'd driven all this way, steeled myself to face my father, maybe even hear his last words. But now it was clear, this wasn't about him. It wasn't about closure or reconciliation. They hadn't called me because he wanted to see me. They'd called me because they wanted something. I took a step back, letting the weight of their deceit settle in. "Let me get this straight," I said slowly, my voice cold. "Father didn't ask for me. You brought me here to get me involved in whatever mess you're in. Didn't you?" My mother reached out to touch my arm, her expression pleading. "Jacob, please. Your father, he's not well. And the family business, it's not what it used to be." "Let me guess," I said, cutting her off. "You're on the brink of bankruptcy." Her silence, paired with the guilt flashing in her eyes, was all the confirmation I needed. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But with your help, we could turn things around. You're smart, talented, you've built a successful business on your own. And we need that now." I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping before I could stop it. 12 years, I said, my voice shaking with disbelief. 12 years of silence. 12 years of being written off, of knowing you didn't care what happened to me. And now you call me back because you need a bailout. I turned on my heel, determined to leave. But before I could reach the door, Madison stepped in front of me, her expression a mix of desperation and determination. "Jacob, please," she said, her voice cracking. "This is still your family." I froze, the word family catching in my chest like a thorn. My family. The same family that had cast me aside when I chose my own path. The same family that had let me go without so much as a goodbye. And now they dared to invoke that word. "Family," I repeated, my tone icy. "Don't you dare lecture me about family, Madison. You're only saying that because you need something. If you didn't, I wouldn't even be here right now." Her face crumpled slightly, but she held her ground. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising. "This isn't just about money. It's about everything. The legacy, the name, everything we've worked for is at stake." I stared at her, feeling the weight of her words and hating the part of me that still cared. A part of me wanted to yell, to tell them all exactly what I thought of their so-called legacy. But another part, buried deep, wondered if walking away again would really be the answer. "Let me make something clear," I said finally, my voice steady and low. "I didn't build my life just to get dragged back into yours. I'm not here to save the Lexington name. And I'm not your safety net. I came because I thought my father wanted to see me, not because of some scheme to use me." Madison flinched at my words, and Lila looked away, her expression tight. "Jacob," my mother said, her voice softer now, more fragile. "He's dying. If you don't want to help us, fine. But at least see him. Please." I hesitated, torn between the anger boiling inside me and the guilt I'd been trying to ignore. "I'll think about it," I said finally, my voice colder than I intended. Then, without another word, I walked past them, heading toward the door. Madison's voice wavered. "Father's proud, you know that. He'd never ask for help himself, but we need you." I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that seemed to echo in the room. "You didn't need me for 12 years, Madison. You were fine with me walking away, fine with him cutting me off. And now, all of a sudden, you need me? I'm supposed to just drop everything and fix your problems." They fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt seeing the unease in their faces, but it faded as quickly as it came. They'd made their choices, just like I had. And then a voice cut through the silence. "Jacob." I turned to see my father standing in the doorway. He looked frail, his shoulders hunched and his face drawn with age and illness. But despite his diminished frame, his presence still filled the room. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, burned with the fire of a man who had ruled his world without compromise. "Father," I said, nodding in acknowledgement. "Let them talk," he commanded, his tone clipped. He gestured for me to follow him, his movements slower but still purposeful. I followed him down the hallway into his study, the same room where he'd disowned me all those years ago. The door clicked shut behind us, and he motioned for me to sit in the same chair I'd sat in that fateful day. I remained standing. "So," he began, his voice tight and heavy with accusation, "you've come crawling back after all your big talk about independence. Here you are." A surge of anger flared in me, but I held it back. "I didn't come crawling back," I said evenly. "I came because I was told you wanted to see me." Apparently, that was a lie. His jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He glanced away for a moment, unwilling to fully admit the truth. "Your mother and sisters acted on their own," he said finally, his voice taut. "I don't need your help, Jacob." "Good," I shot back. "Because I'm not offering it." For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us thick with tension. His face was a mask of frustration and stubborn pride, but beneath it, I saw something else, something I'd never seen before. Vulnerability. He broke the silence, his voice quieter now but still carrying the weight of years of authority. "I built this family," he said, almost a whisper. "Everything we have, everything you grew up with, that was me. And now, when I need you most, you turn your back." I shook my head, anger and disappointment swirling in my chest. "You didn't build a family, Father. You built an empire. And you expected us to fall in line like obedient soldiers. You pushed me away. You disowned me because I wouldn't be your puppet. And now, because you're in trouble, you suddenly expect me to apologize and fall back in line." His eyes narrowed, the lines on his face deepening as he studied me. The silence between us was suffocating, heavy with the unspoken battles we'd fought over the years. Finally, he spoke, his voice sharp and commanding. "Apologize," he said, the word cutting through the air like a blade. "Apologize for what?" I took a step closer, my voice rising as years of resentment bubbled to the surface. "For treating me like a pawn in your game. For trying to control every aspect of my life. For disowning me when I refused to be the person you wanted me to be. For never, not once, seeing me as anything other than a reflection of yourself." His expression hardened, but I caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice quieter now. "For the family. For you. You call it control. I call it preparation. You wouldn't understand the sacrifices I made to give you this life." "No," I said, my tone cold. "You didn't do it for us. You did it for yourself. For your legacy. You wanted to be remembered as the great Tom Lexington, the man who built an empire. But you didn't care who you had to break in the process. Not me, not Madison, not anyone." For the first time, he looked away, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of his years was finally catching up to him. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something softer, something raw. "You think I don't regret it," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "The choices I made. The way things turned out." The admission caught me off guard, my anger faltering. "You have no idea what it's like," he continued, his tone bitter, "to carry the burden of an entire family, to know that one mistake could destroy everything." I wanted to yell, to tell him he'd done it all wrong, that he'd let his obsession with control destroy the very thing he claimed to protect. But instead, I stayed silent, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of the man in front of me, the man who had loomed so large in my life but now seemed so small. "Walking away. Turning your back on this family," my father said, his voice trembling with anger. "If you do that, I might consider letting you help." I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that echoed in the quiet study. "You're unbelievable. After everything, after all the years I spent trying to please you, you still think you have the right to demand anything from me? I don't owe you an apology, and I sure as hell don't owe you anything else." His fists clenched, his face flushed with barely contained rage. "If you walk out that door, Jacob, you're done. This family will never forgive you. I will never forgive you." I took a deep breath, letting his words sink in. And for the first time in my life, I felt peace. A deep, unshakable calm settled over me, extinguishing the fire of resentment that had burned for years. "That's fine," I said quietly, meeting his glare with unwavering resolve. "Because I forgave myself a long time ago." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the study, leaving him behind, seething in his silence. As I stepped into the hallway, I saw my mother, Madison, and Lila waiting, their faces a mix of hope and fear. I didn't stop to explain. I didn't owe them anything, either. I kept walking, past the cold stares and unspoken questions, past the weight of their expectations, and out into the cool night air. This time, I wasn't leaving in anger. I wasn't running away in frustration. I was leaving on my terms. And for the first time, it felt right. That night, after the confrontation, I stayed in a small inn on the edge of town. The thought of staying under the same roof as my father was unbearable. Not after what he'd said. Not after the ultimatum he'd given me. The familiar anger and disappointment I'd carried for years were back, lingering in the back of my mind. But alongside them was something unexpected, a strange, quiet calm. For the first time, I felt free from his grip, free from the expectations that had weighed me down for so long. I'd spoken my truth, and I wasn't looking back. The next morning, as I packed up my things, there was a knock at my door. I opened it, expecting to see a staff member. Instead, I found my mother, Sarah, standing there. She looked different. The polished, elegant facade she'd always worn was softened by exhaustion. Her hair was slightly out of place, and the lines on her face seemed deeper, etched by years of quiet endurance. But her eyes were warm, filled with a sincerity I hadn't seen in a long time. "Jacob," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" I hesitated for a moment, then nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She moved slowly, as though the weight of the years, and of the previous night, had finally caught up with her. She sat down on the edge of the bed, folding her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor as if gathering the courage to speak. I stayed silent, waiting. "I know last night was difficult," she began, her voice shaky but steady enough to carry the words. "I want you to know that I understand why you left. I've always understood, even if I didn't show it." Her voice faltered, and she glanced away, her composure slipping. For a moment, she seemed smaller, more human than I'd ever allowed myself to see her. "For years, I stood by your father," she continued, her tone heavy with regret. "I supported his decisions because Because I thought it was best for the family. I thought I was doing the right thing." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "But I see now that we made mistakes. He made mistakes. And I did too." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Growing up, my mother had always been the quiet force behind my father, the one who enforced his rules with a soft smile and unyielding resolve. She was the peacemaker, the silent enabler, the voice of reason that never questioned his authority. "I should have spoken up," she said, her voice breaking. "When he disowned you, when he pushed you away, I should have fought for you. But I didn't. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life." I stared at her, the anger I'd carried for years softening at the edges. This was the first time I'd ever seen her so vulnerable, so open. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. "Because," she said, finally looking up at me, "I don't want you to walk away thinking we never cared. I don't want you to leave with nothing but bitterness in your heart. I know I can't fix the past, Jacob. But I'm asking, begging, you not to let it destroy whatever chance you have at peace." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a long moment, I didn't respond. I wanted to hold on to my anger, to use it as a shield against the pain of the past. But as I looked at her, I realized that anger wasn't serving me anymore. "I forgave myself," I said finally, my voice steady. "But forgiving you, forgiving him, that's going to take time." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I understand. I just hope one day you'll find it in your heart to forgive us too." She had always stayed in the background, supporting him without question, her quiet strength woven into the fabric of our family. To hear her acknowledge the mistakes of the past, to see her vulnerability laid bare, was something I never anticipated. "I'm sorry, Jacob," she said, her voice trembling as she met my eyes. Tears shimmered on the brink of falling. "For not standing up for you. For letting him push you away. I should have done more. I should have been there for you." I swallowed hard, a lump rising in my throat. For years, I had carried the weight of resentment, the sting of abandonment. But hearing her apology, so raw and sincere, cracked that bitterness just a little. "Thank you," I managed, my voice rough with emotion. "It means a lot." She nodded, her hand reaching out to squeeze mine. "I want to make things right, Jacob. I know it won't erase the past, but I want to be in your life. If you'll let me." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw more than the silent partner to my father. She was her own person, flawed but willing to confront those flaws. She had made mistakes, yes, but she was trying to mend what was broken. I nodded, feeling the beginnings of a cautious hope. As she stood to leave, she paused by the door, looking back at me with a sad smile. "Your father, he may never change. But he does care for you, in his own way. Maybe someday, you two will find a way to understand each other." I didn't reply. Her words lingered, even after she left. It was hard to imagine my father apologizing or admitting he'd been wrong. That kind of humility seemed beyond him. And yet, there was a part of me, a quiet, battered part, that wanted to believe it was possible. The next morning, I decided to go for a walk, hoping the crisp air would clear my head. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of gold and pink as I wandered aimlessly. As I made my way back to the inn, I spotted a figure standing by the entrance. His hands were shoved into his pockets, his posture tense and uncertain, a stark contrast to the confident, imposing man I'd always known. It was my father. For a moment, I considered turning back, avoiding whatever confrontation was waiting. But something about the way he stood, hesitant, almost vulnerable, made me pause. "Jacob," he said, his voice low and cautious. "Do you have a moment?" I nodded, my steps slow and deliberate as I approached. He didn't meet my eyes, his gaze fixed somewhere on the ground as though searching for the right words. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable, until he finally spoke. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "About everything. About the way I treated you. The things I said." He paused, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "I was wrong." The words hung in the air, almost surreal. My father, the man who had built his life on pride and control, was admitting he was wrong. "I pushed you too hard," he continued, still not looking at me. "I thought I was doing what was best for you. For the family. But I see now that he faltered, his voice catching. I only drove you away. I stared at him, my mind reeling. The man standing before me was not the same person who had disowned me all those years ago. His voice, his posture, even the way he avoided my gaze, all of it spoke of a vulnerability I had never thought him capable of. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said finally, his voice barely audible. I needed you to know that I'm sorry. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The words I'd longed to hear for years were finally being spoken, but they didn't bring the instant closure I'd imagined. Instead, they cracked something open inside me, a fragile, aching hope that perhaps the bridge between us wasn't beyond repair. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said slowly, my voice steady but tinged with the pain of old wounds. Not yet. But, thank you for saying it. He nodded, his shoulders sagging as though the admission had drained him. I don't deserve it, he said quietly, but I hope, one day, you'll find it in yourself to try. We stood there in silence, the gap between us no longer insurmountable but still vast. I need time, I said finally. I understand, he replied. It wasn't the reconciliation I'd always imagined, nor was it the vindication I'd sometimes dreamed of. But it was a start. I drove you away, he said, his voice trembling as he finally looked up and met my eyes. For the first time, I saw something I never thought I'd see in him, regret. It was raw and unguarded, the weight of years etched into his face. I can't change the past, Jacob, he said, his tone thick with emotion. But I want to try to make things right. If you'll let me. I stood there, stunned, unable to process what was happening. For years, I'd imagined this moment, hearing him acknowledge the pain he'd caused, the damage he'd done. But now that it was here, I didn't know how to respond. The words I'd carried like armor, the speeches I'd rehearsed in anger, all seemed to dissolve in the quiet morning air. I don't expect forgiveness, he continued softly. I needed you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. His apology was clumsy and awkward, but it was real. I could hear the honesty in his voice, see it in the slight shake of his hands. In that moment, I realized something. Holding on to my anger and resentment all these years, it hadn't just been weighing me down. It had been consuming me, keeping me tied to the very pain I wanted to escape. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing what he'd done. It was about freeing myself. I forgive you, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The words felt strange, foreign, like an unfamiliar language. But as they left my lips, they felt right. I saw the flicker of relief in his eyes, the slight easing of the tension in his shoulders. A weight he'd carried, maybe for years, seemed to lift. Thank you, he said, his voice breaking as he looked away, taking a shaky breath. I don't deserve it. But thank you. We stood there for a long moment, the silence between us no longer heavy with anger, but something quieter, something that almost felt like understanding. The wounds of the past would never fully heal. Some scars run too deep for that. But maybe, just maybe, we could start to rebuild. One step at a time. That day marked a turning point, not just for me, but for my entire family. My father and I were never going to have a perfect relationship. Too much had happened, too much time had been lost. But we had something new, a fragile, tentative connection built on honesty and a shared willingness to try. It wasn't easy. There were moments of awkwardness, of old frustrations threatening to resurface. But for the first time, there was also effort on both sides. Conversations that weren't about control or expectations, but about understanding. As for my mother and sisters, the shift was slower, more subtle. They, too, had their own regrets to face, their own roles in the rift to acknowledge. But my decision to forgive, to let go of the bitterness, created a ripple effect. It gave us all permission to start again. And for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. Peace in knowing that I wasn't defined by my family's mistakes. Peace in knowing that I wasn't alone anymore. Most of all, peace in knowing that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It simply meant choosing to move forward.